Hello, everyone. I'll give you a second to get connected to sound. Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1315th New Social Environment. I'm Magley, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being here MC today for a conversation featuring Gabrielle Goliath and Eriola Pira. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Through the ritual, sonic, and social encounters of her art practice, Gabrielle Goliath attends and tends to histories and present-day conditions of differentially valued life, convening what she terms a radical familiar. Her works invites meetings in and across difference on terms of complicity, relation, and love. The tender engagement and criticality of Goliath's decolonial Black feminist practice is well acknowledged in South Africa and globally. Her awards include the Future Generation Art Prize, Special Prize, and the Standard Bank Young Artist Award. Her work has been exhibited internationally and is held in several international collections. And our host today, Eriola Pira, is a researcher and curator. She is the curator and director of programs at the Veralist Center for Arts and Politics at the New School. In this capacity, she works closely with artists to explore, commission, and present new ideas and work on arts and its politics, including exhibitions, performances, and publications. She's held previous positions at Art in General, NARS Foundation, and the Foundation for Culture and Society, as well as contributed to and collaborated with institutions worldwide. And with that, I will hand it over to Ariola to get us started.
Thank you so much, Macaulay, so much, Chloe, Joshua, and everyone at the Brooklyn Rail for this invitation. Wow, oh my God, 1,000+ episodes. It's really incredible what you do day in and day out, and it's a true privilege to join you and especially Gabrielle in this conversation. Um, I want us to really start with Gabrielle's work, which is what we're gathered, and to really sort of have that ground the conversation and really sort of open up space for us to explore the work that's currently on view at MoMA PS1, personal accounts, and other ways of sort of approaching this work in Gabrielle's broader practice. So Joshua, if you can please get us started with one of the videos.
Uh, uh, um, God, um, 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 uh, um, um, uh, um, um, um,
One moment, everyone.
Um, um, uh, um, 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 uh, um, um, oh, um, um, oh,
Thank you so much. I thought it was a good idea to start with the work, Gabrielle, and to really kind of open up this conversation there. I had the privilege of, I guess, being in New York and attending the opening of the exhibition at MoMA PS1. And it's one thing to read about an artist's work and kind of see installation shots and kind of in some ways even having seen sort of small clips. And it's yet another one to experience, to be in that space and kind of be enveloped by sort of an environment of these survivors and their stories, and yet their stories are kind of absent, and you're kind of invited as a viewer to really sit and be present. And I think that was something that I wanted us to kind of, in some ways, replicate a little bit to the extent that the Zoom space allows for presence. And again, I also want to thank all of you who've joined us today for this conversation. And so with that, Gabrielle, I want to invite you to tell us a little bit about this project. When we'll unpack it and kind of really get into some of the details of sort of what's sort of at stake with the project, but maybe walk us through a little bit through the installation, the ways in which you collaborate with each of the survivors, and kind of just again walk us through the project in your own words.
Thank you, Eriola, and thank you to you all. It's lovely to gather with you all this evening. Well, morning for you, evening for me. So, personal accounts, and I always go back to this statement because for me it's really critical that I reiterate and preface this work with this statement. And I always say, a personal accounts is not a work about violence. Personal accounts is a Black, decolonial, feminist work of survival and repair. And that's really very central to this work. I could give you a sense because I think durée and long time is quite key to many of my works, and just give you a sense of where this work started and how it's grown and developed into a transnational work of survival and repair. I, in 2014, was grappling with this, what I believe to be a false dichotomy of the so-called voiced and voiceless. And I was thinking about, what does it mean to come to these experiences, to these accounts, in ways that refuses what is so often demanded of survivors. That is to be legible, credible, believable. But of course, we know that the account of a survivor so regularly discredited, silenced, done away with. And I was wanting to do so in a way, of course, that I'm not wanting to, of course, replicate that violence or return to that scene of subjection, abjection, but do a different kind of work. So when I first produced this work in 2014, I worked very closely with a small group of Black and Brown women who were survivors of racialized and sexualized violence. And I was really trying to think about what happens when you forgo lexicality. What happens when you simply remain with those spaces in between, the paralinguistic, the hums, the cries, the smacking of lips, the coughs, the laughter, the intake and outtake of breath. So it's a different kind of coming to. And of course, it also, as I said, refuses systemic endemic structures that would often relegate these individuals to that space of unbelievability. And so to think of these alternative lexicons and grammars of voicing, of presencing, of speaking out. And it was then coming to this, what for me was a fairly radical realization of how do I begin to create a form of transnational allyship? Because as I said, this is not a work about violence. This is really a work about patriarchy. It's a kind of normative order that shapes and informs all of our lives in this world, in this very difficult world of ours. And to really consider how I might bring into, to use some of Eriola's words in our conversation we had, a sort of polyphonic allyship. But one, of course, that really critically does not collapse the differences, of course, that exist within these different communities that are brought into relation with one another. And to consider how one might create that transnational labor of really what is ultimately a gifting and a presencing that these individuals afford us within this work. Personal accounts. And of course, I've since, and maybe we could get into it, I've produced it in multiple cities across the world. And this, of course, has also come by way of my work traveling outside of South Africa and coming into encounter with other communities and opening up these radical spaces for others to share with me, speak to me of their own experiences, and me picking up on this injunction to realize this work across geographies and across different spaces and communities.
Thank you. That's a great place, I think, for us to kind of start, maybe even looking a little bit into some earlier work, but really sort of more broadly, I think, speak about your practice, which you've described as life work of mourning. And I wonder what it means for you to commit to mourning, not as a discrete project or a theme, which clearly this isn't, but really as an ongoing artistic and ethical orientation over time. In describing elegy, a work that we'll speak about in this hour that we have together, for example, you use the word labor, not work, which struck me for its distinction from, let's say, artwork as a self-contained thing, a project that sort of circulates within the art world and the ways in which that's sort of bound with all of its own problematics. And life work is not that. But there's another meaning to life work that you also speak about, that is that this is life-affirming work as opposed to death work. And I wonder if we can kind of start there. How do you engage with the dead, with mourning and grief as life work?
Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful prompt. Well, it's not an easy, really distinction between the two.
Yeah.
Life work is tethered to death. Death as tethered as a frame and form of positionality to Black, to brown, to femme, queer, trans life. And as such, those subjects rendered available to being killable, violable, disposable, ungrievable. So in undertaking this life work demands a kind of tending and attending, as I say in my bio, attending and tending to these losses, to these deaths. And I often say, for me, the radical premise there is to carry these losses with us, because to even begin to imagine imagine a world more lovable, hospitable, is premised on us carrying these losses with us. But nonetheless, of course, it is to really think about, and of course, we can speak of this in relation to a work like Elegy and Berenice as well. It is also considering, how does one possibly imagine possibility within a situation of impossibility? As my work addresses itself towards these lives, these particular frames of lives I speak of, it's not to imagine, this hereafter of a perfect life, but it is to work within that difficulty, and it's in spite of work. So the imperative of life, of course, as well, is it's a kind of work.
Oh, we've just lost your audio, or at least I have. Can you? I can no longer hear you.
Gabrielle, do you maybe have like a Bluetooth connected device that your audio may have switched to?
I'll check.
Oh, I hear you
You're
now.
back.
I'm back.
You're back. It was a momentary lapse of voice and voicelessness. I think the glitch is replicating it.
Yes. Okay, you can hear me now.
We can.
Okay, all right. Okay. So to return to the imperative of this life is, as I said, and it was a profound realization in relation to a work like Berenice, to think about, and we can get into more detail about the work and giving others a context for it. But
So maybe actually I can sort of move into sort of another way of kind of, I think, continuing this thread, which is that Berenice is a very personal sense of intimate personal loss. This is a childhood friend who was shot at home in an accident of domestic violence, and it's really sort of anchored so much of your work and your approach in how you work with her memory, her story, her what she means to you, but also then I think thinking about Berenice in a more wider framework and having folks kind of, I think, and yourself as well, you appear in this work and you can tell us a little bit more. And so I'm curious about sort of that balance between and sort of how you navigate between an individual and sort of sense of individual and personal loss to forms of collective loss and grief, especially when it comes to sort of gendered and racialized violence and sort of what that move looks like for you and in your work, without allowing one to subsume or sort of instrumentalize the other. Sort of how do you hold on to both? Because I feel like they also need very different approaches, but I think you've also been able to kind of, I think, approach them also in a very similar way.
Mm-hmm. Well, as with life and death, the individual and the collective, of course, is also very entangled. What is quite bedrock to my practice is specificity.
Mm.
What does it mean to invite others to orientate themselves towards a particular individual? One who I insist upon being named, loved, and now grieved after, and recalled with love and regard. And that, of course, with a work like Berenice and every other work of mine, demands sensitive tending to these structures of violence that have the capacity to desubjectify, to render individuals faceless, nameless statistics.
Yeah, just a number.
And absolutely, those numerics, that cold calculus of violence. What does it mean to refuse that? And of course, invoke and channel a particular individual, a particular loss, that being Berenice. So absolutely, Berenice was a childhood friend of mine, and known personally to me. But nonetheless, in inviting others to a work such as Berenice that refuses this order of violence and seeks to continue, live on through channeling and presencing, invokes her absent presence in ways that does present a kind of demand on those who come to the work. That collective that comes to the work in ways that is not a safe remove. What does it mean to come into relation with another not known to you, not necessarily knowable, to come across that difference, but to nonetheless respond to the bearing, respond to this invitation to carry this loss. And of course, importantly, in thinking about Berenice as an individual, one has to attend to, as I said, this idea of differentially valued life. What has produced that? What has made that possible? What has rendered Black and brown girlhood available to be violated and disposed of? And this, of course, demands thinking about these longer histories of slavery, indentured labor, the absolute rapture of lives, and how that then seeps into the personal, intimate spaces of the home. Yeah.
I think there's a way in which your work insists on presence, and we've already sort of hinted at this, without necessarily offering legibility or sort of easily sort of bite-sized ways of kind of understanding and sort of sitting with these histories and these sort of experiences. And I'm wondering sort of how your work really sort of thinks about that tension between visibility and presence and legibility. And we'll get into the ways in which, in particular, personal accounts refuses voice and voicelessness and narrative and sort of the sort of the textual in some ways. Especially, I think, in relation to an audience's desire to understand or to resolve what they encounter. I think often audiences come to a work like this, I think, wanting to kind of walk away with a sense of understanding or a sort of I think a legibility or a closure that your work doesn't always, I think, allow very easily, but instead, I think, offers something else other than sort of closure. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about whether that resonates, or maybe I'm sort of completely misreading that. But there's a way in which your work doesn't allow for like an easy thing that you walk away with. That presence, and you take it with you. It remains with you.
I think it's, to really think carefully about our experiences are not commensurate one to the other. So personal accounts invites you into a difficult, sticky relation to others. And I think that it is also to think, as I said, who are the subjects within this work? What are the demands often placed on them? What does it mean to refuse that? And there's something beautifully agential in that. So the way in which a work like personal accounts comes about, it really is thinking about self-determination and presentation. And what is shared? How do these individuals who come to the work presence themselves? Is visibility key, as is so often the case with, say, many of my collaborators who are trans, who are trying to presence themselves and make themselves highly visible, or and these are also conditions of safety. What are the terms of participation? Sometimes that withholding is absolutely agential. It is all about feeling safe and secure and able to presence yourself and share. And those conditions of participation and the degree to which you withhold, you share, you determine how you render yourself legible in relation to others is such a highly relational conversation with those participants, those collaborators that I work with in personal accounts.
And we'll get into speech, voice, and what exceeds language, which is, I think, part of what I really want to get to. But I think maybe this would be a good moment to speak a little bit about the offerings that these participants bring, and you speak of them as gifts. So the survivor offerings are a component of this body of work that is accessible on your website, and I think that's being linked in the chat. And I wonder, Joshua or Magli, whether we can experience one of these offerings from one of the survivors.
Hmm.
Give me 1 second.
Absolutely, take your time. And maybe Gabrielle, you could, while Magli sort of cues it up, you can say a little bit about the idea and sort of the ways in which the survivor offerings function within the work.
They are beautiful. So with personal accounts, as a work that absolutely interrogates this notion of the voiced and the voiceless, and considers these alternative grammars and ways of being for growing lexicality. And as I said, that absolute agential imperative that drives a work like this. What does it mean for each one of these participants to determine what they share and how they share? You will, of course, in these offerings, these alternative offerings, because of course there is this editorial intervention with each one in the withholding of the words. But each collaborator is invited to share an offering that is held on my website. And you will, in coming to these offerings, you will encounter devastating accounts of extreme violence, in some instances rape, in some instances with some of the collaborators in Kiev, internment, torture. But you will also encounter prayers and songs and chants and poems. And these all tap into these beautiful alternative quotidian queer survival practices. And they're very beautiful and they're very profound. We will, I think, be sharing some of them with you later as well. Which one did you want us to begin with, Eriola?
I think the sound piece, which is Trayvon's Liturgy for Survival in D major.
So there's a river. Who's doing? Is it Joshua?
Magli, I can also send it to you via chat if that's okay.
And then you would click on Trayvon, Magli, is the liturgy at the bottom. There we go.
Oh, wonderful. So if we can make some space and sort of sit with this offering.
There's a river, a river. There's a river. river of birds. There's a river of birds in migration, a nation of women with wings. A river of birds in migration, a nation of warriors who sing.
That's perhaps a beautiful place for us to pause and think about sound. Think about chorus and polyphony in this instance. It's one distinct voice that we're experiencing, but in the installation itself, it's polyvocal. There's a chorus. There's a way in which your work really attends to the multiplicity of voices, even if you're sometimes hearing just a singular account. Um, and so this is the choral form and polyphony is recurrent in your practice more broadly than just in this particular work. And I think there's sort of an instance in resisting the singular authorship or testimony and sort of making a particular account sort of an exemplary. It's part of a larger, I think, systemic and sort of thinking about voice. Not as something that one lacks or has, but as something that's structured by power, relation, and risk. And so I kind of want us to think a little bit about what does the chorus allow you to do? I think politically, effectively, structurally in your work, that a singular voice cannot.
I think I'll start by talking about it to multiple works.
Please, this would be a great time to do so.
So with a work like personal accounts, and for those of you who haven't experienced it, the sonics of it is absolutely somatic and foreground. And as Eriola says, these are voices sounding out in open sound and in relation to each other. This is not composed or choreographed sound. This is aleatory, unwieldy sound, sounding out, resonating. Sound, of course, builds. It builds within a space. It works on us somatically. And as so many people have expressed to me, it has the capacity to enter our bodies, inhabit our bodies, linger and remain. Even once you've exited that space, there's a bit of the work that leaves with you. So there's an absolute affective drive. There's structurally, conceptually, formally, there's an imperative for me at least, to work with alternative grammars. If I am to refuse what can sometimes be running that risk of enacting a further form of violence within my art, which I absolutely believe art has the capacity to do. Peddling in a form of suffering or objection, I look to these alternative modalities, such as sound, to do a different kind of work and create a different kind of encounter for those who come to it. Because I say, and I always say this, those who come to my work, they come to it and they participate within it. It's not a safe remove. It's not just the hegemony of the ocular and the gaze. It's a form of relation and interacting and engaging. Polyphony, multiple voices, absolutely. With personal accounts, it's really important for me to not exceptionalize one narrative over another, be it Kiev or Tunis or femicide and rape culture in South Africa or whatever that may be, but to rather think about, and here I turn to the magisterial Françoise Vergès, we cannot silo these social ills. We cannot, it's too easy to then tick a box and think, well, GBV, ecocide. No, they are entangled. We cannot think of one without thinking of how they are produced and rendered absolutely devastatingly normative. So that is imperative to think of these voices in relation to each other and in difficult relation, not always easy relation. And then work such as elegy, or a work of mine called chorus. In the one, it takes the form of a lament. 7 classically trained opera singers sustain and sing a single note, B natural, for an hour. In this instance, it is the singular note. It is a particular single individual that steps up and enacts, as you say, a very vulnerable sounding out. It's beautiful and absolutely virtuosic. This work is so pared down and may seem very simple, but it's a gargantuan labor undertaken by these performers.
Yeah.
But even then, with a work such as Elegy, even though it's a singular sounding out, the sound bulls and resonates and creates microtones. And just recently having performed, which we can talk a little bit about as well, Elegy for a Poet, and working within a space in a theatre in District 6 in Cape Town, which of course was also so key because it's thinking about addressing dispossessed, displaced lives and thinking of that from District 6 that carries the traces of that. Even there, these voices that were sounding out were resonating with the architecture of the theatre space and creating buzzing and all sorts of strange sounds. And then, of course, to think of that and to think of it in relation to a work like Chorus, where I worked with a choir. And there, in that instance, it's collective breath. And even as one singer may have run out of breath, they have their fellow singers to sustain them and carry them along. So sound is key, and it's also thinking about, my work is highly relational. So if I'm thinking about how do we consider different ways of knowing and coming to each other, that to some degree, as I said, is premised on a kind of acceptance of unknowing. But nonetheless, that your pain may not be mine, but it does call out to me and it does have a bearing on me.
Yeah.
And I think sound can really powerfully invoke that, invoke that kind of relation.
But you also speak about, and I really love this term, and I told you the other day that I'm kind of obsessed with it, the sonics of knowing, and sort of some of the curatorial work that I've been doing at the Verilist Center around our focus theme, sort of matter of intelligence. We're looking at ways of knowing. How do we come to know, and sort of what does intelligence look like? And so I think as soon as I kind of encountered this sort of phrase in terms of your work, I think it opened up ways of thinking about where does knowing sit? How do we kind of encounter it? And rather thinking about knowing in the ways in which it is felt, heard, and sort of sensed rather than articulated. And so I think there's always, I think, in terms of intelligence or knowledge, that question of sort of legibility and lexicality. And I think sort of in your refusing to kind of default to that, and the ways in which we're sort of often asking victims, especially, I think, to kind of have to attend to sort of recounting and accounting sort of the violence through lexicality, through sort of written or sort of spoken records. Sound in your work does something else. It sort of operates as a mode of knowledge, of memory, of transmission, of sort of recognizing, again, as you say, loss, but also presence and ways in which we carry, let's say, ancestors forward. And I wonder if maybe this is also a good moment, I think, to speak about sort of the knowing, but also I think this question of whose life is recognized as a life worth grieving after. And I think maybe sort of speak a little bit about elegy and sort of the ways in which that work, which is an ongoing body of work for you, was slated to represent South Africa at this year's coming Venice Biennial and was canceled by the Minister of Culture. And so if you can walk us a little bit through that work and the ways in which it speaks precisely to what it is that your work is trying to do, which is to recognize those lives that have been rendered in many ways unworthy of being grieved or sort of recognized.
I'll begin by
Yes. Lots here to unpack, so figure out a way to tease it all together.
Absolutely. I'll circle back to Berenice and then come back to elegy. But on the morning after Berenice was killed, I went and saw her mother. And upon seeing me, she called out not my name, not Gabrielle, but Berenice. And I always speak of it. It felt like it then, and it continues to feel like that because I carry it with me. It was this sunken chord. It was this name that sank deep into me. And of course, that's sound, right? And I bear it, and I carry it with me. It was spoken over me. And a work like Berenice, which is all about according regard and avowal to ungrievable, unlovable brown girlhood, subject to this violence, so easily disposed of. There's something so radical about me carrying that sunken chord with me, that name, bearing it, asking others to bear it within a work like Berenice, those who presence themselves, gift themselves, stand in for the absent presence of Berenice, because of course let's remember that this is not a work of resolution. She has gone. Nonetheless, to refuse that, to recall her in the name of love. And to insist upon the recognition of her life as grievable. With a work like Elegy, absolutely, I first initiated this work in 2015. I came to I'm trying to think about how to begin to say this, but it was for me a radical encounter with a father, Christine Ipeleng Moholani, her father, Isaac Moholani, speaking on a radio show about the rape and murder of his daughter. And for me, thinking, how do I come to this? To a father in the depths of loss and sorrow, who nonetheless is still finding the words in that space to speak out, to enjoin us, these others out there, to refuse what's happened to his daughter and to insist that it not happen to another. And of course, me thinking about how do I broach this loss, this unspeakable loss? How do I commemorate and honor the life of Ipeleng? How do I broach this normative crisis of femicide and rape culture in South Africa that renders so many available to racialized, sexualized, gendered violence? And of course, this has been, as with many of my works, has a long durée. I began this work in 2015. Every time it is performed and enacted, I speak of it as the work of ritual invocation. There's something about it that exceeds, we were talking about labor and work, it exceeds the artwork. It is not an indelible bronze sculpture. It is the performed, tenuous, radical labor, not economized labor, radical labor of Black feminist love, insisting upon the recognition and the grievability of certain lives. This is a work orientated towards Black, brown, femme, queer, trans individuals lost to this order of violence. Contemporary losses, but also attending to a longer history with certain iterations directed towards two enslaved women who were enslaved in the Cape. In that, working closely with a historian, Dr. Sarah Jaffe, who scripted these beautiful eulogistic texts directed towards them, accounting for and thinking about the conditions that make possible rape, culture, and femicide as this crisis norm in South Africa. And of course, thinking very carefully about what I wanted to present at the pavilion at this very moment in Venice. Elegy grapples with these difficult questions of whose lives count and whose lives are grievable. And what does it mean to, it's a suite, it's 3 suites of elegy directed to the very first individual whom I commemorated in this work, Ipoleng Christine Mohalani. Of course, that's important. That's important to insist upon the fact that this is life work, and I still continue to grieve after Ipoleng 10 years after her death. The second suite directed towards 2 Nama ancestors lost to the Nama over Herero genocide in Namibia. And of course, the third suite directed towards Hiba Abu Nada, a Palestinian poet who was killed in an Israeli attack, air strike. And that, of course, that the work hadn't even been produced at the stage at that point of it being cancelled. It was just the idea of this work.
Renders it.
Exactly. What is it that renders that particular address of elegy heretical? You cannot grieve this individual because they are not recognized as worth, as you said, Eriola, as worth grieving.
I mean, there's ways in which collectively we've not been able to grieve and even acknowledge what is going on. And I was kind of struck that because you are so attentive to sort of a singular person in this case, and it's not an exceptional loss by any means, given the scale of what we've seen unfold in Gaza, but even by sort of isolating or sort of exceptionalizing it in some ways, which you would think would make it somewhat more acceptable, even that is wholly unable to kind of be allowed and to kind of function, so that there's a way in which let's say, the rendering voiceless that you do in your work, it's kind of magnified in some ways and kind of taken to an extreme when the state or sort of another way in which sort of at a collective level that censoring of these stories kind of is sort of enacted. And I think I'm struck also by the way in which you talk about your work as repair work. And I wonder, and to sort of just looking at time, if we can kind of sit with that, repair as a recurring concern in your practice, but never as really sort of a simple gesture of healing and closure, as we spoke about earlier. And so I think in thinking about the work that you've shared with us here today, and really sort of how you're approaching the next stage of elegy, and you can speak a little bit about the ways in which you're appealing, and I think sort of there's ways in which this work might actually return and hopefully will return and will be shown in Venice this May, is also a way of sort of holding power accountable, especially in contexts where it's shaped by ongoing harm. And how do we kind of think about sort of the unresolved injustice that your work also attends to?
Absolutely. It is not about resolution, as you say. It is not about false comfort. To cite Maneo Mohale, who is an incredible dear friend, magnificent poet, who is actually scripting, I have commissioned them to script the Ghazal in commemoration of Hiba Abu Nada. They speak of healing, but I think of healing and repair is always incomplete. But I think that, and perhaps I'm also going to share something quite personal in with a work like Elegy, for example. So the work is so Spartan in form and 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 difficult and absolutely demanding. It's also a highly conceptual work, as you can imagine. It, as personal accounts, forgoes lexicality, it forgoes and refuses narrative. There's no beginning and end, and there's absolutely no form of release or entertainment in this work. It is the continual, relentless sustaining of that B natural note. And as you can imagine, preparing my performers for a work like this is not easy. It takes a toll on them psychically, emotionally, and physically. By the time they get to the end of this work, they are utterly spent. And they speak of it as such hard, difficult work, and it's difficult for them to contain themselves, to keep themselves together within a work like this. And we speak about that. We speak about, to maybe pick up on that prefix of of repair, of return, and of repetition, the repetition of this note. And this is also something that people who've come to my work have challenged me on, because I was always very wary of deploying terms like the reparative within my work. But I've been pushed to really consider that, because if it is, as you say, if we are to account for an order that renders so many open to violence, and as I said, that cold calculus, those faceless, nameless statistics, in a work like Elegy, and this is what I speak my performers through. What does it mean for them to enact that repetitive work of reinscription and repair? And it is to perform, and it is to enact that work of love, of recognition, of avowal, of regard, to recall a name, to recall a life worth remembering. And that is what drives a work like Elegy, and calls, of course, all those who come to it to participate within that work, because of course it also collapses that remove of a so-called performance and audience. You come and you participate within that work. And a work like Elegy is really so urgent. Me putting forward a work like Elegy for the pavilion is it quite simply is not a career move. And it's not about feeding into sort of endless drive or thirst towards the so-called new, which is one of my absolute pet hates when I meet with curators. So what's new? What are you working on? But the powerful political injunction of that work and what it demands of us all. We may not all know, we cannot fully know each other, even those most close and intimate to us. But how is it that we can still come and relate across that difficulty and that difference? How can we potentially respond to the call of a work like Elegy, which asks that we mourn for those not necessarily known to us, but nonetheless, their loss has a bearing on us.
Absolutely. I don't know that I have a lot more to add to that. I haven't experienced the work, and so I do think there's a way in which, again, as with any of your work, it asks us to sit in and be present. And I think that's true actually in the process of this conversation. Realize that Berenice is actually a photographic work. It isn't a sound-based work, but I think there's that active repetition, that act of return that I think in photographic means does something very similar to, I think, sort of the sonic and performative uh, work that we've also spoken about. And so I think sort of thinking about repair as that return to a wound and that you tend to it is, I think, very generative in this case. And whether that's an individual wound and the loss of a personal friend or a family member, or the more collective losses to systemic and sort of imperial violence that we're unable oftentimes to even pinpoint to a particular um, perpetrator. Even in cases where there is a clear perpetrator, that's not often sayable or sort of identifiable and sort of hold to account. I think in all of those registers, your work, I think, kind of has this insistence to return, to repair, and that requires presence and sitting together. And with that, I want to recognize you and thank you very much for this generous and generative way of bringing us all into your work and your collaborators. And I think at this point, Magli will take us through the Q&A section, but I want to also kind of give you all a heads up so you don't disappear on us that Gabrielle is going to be reading another offering just before we end today. But again, thank you for sitting with us, for being with us, and Gabrielle, thank you so much for your work and again, hoping to see it and experience it in Venice.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. That was such a luminous conversation. To our audience members, there is a link in the chat if you have a question for Gabrielle. You can pose it there and we will turn to you next. The first question we have is I'm curious about how each channel and personal accounts is contained within their own monitor and reposed against the walls. How are you thinking about the aesthetics of display in your work, and more specifically in the context of a museum exhibition?
Thank you. I love that you used the word repose because I always speak of these screens in a state of repose. I knew from the beginning that they would be screens intervening into the space. I'm always thinking, of course, of them conceptually, affectively, for those who come to my work. I'm thinking through how they encounter it and what that form of relation is and what becomes possible, what's invoked somatically, but of course, even formally and architecturally. So that state of repose is absolutely essential and key in that work, and that leaning into, intervening into the space. In terms of all the other decisions, of course, to circle back to what I was saying earlier on, there's so much of it it comes through conversation. It comes through me attending very carefully to each collaborator's wishes for how they wish to presence themselves within that filmic frame. What they want to reveal and share, what they choose to withhold. To think of some of the accounts I filmed in Tunis, for example, where those collaborators were not even comfortable with an abstracted form of representation. So in certain instances where you may just see hands or a shoulder, for example, they absolutely didn't want to presence themselves within the frame. And me thinking about that and in conversation thinking, okay, well, there's the significance of this room. It's not just a random room. It is a room in which many of them gather and have these conversations, and having that stand in for them. So those decisions are often determined in careful dialogue with those who come to the work. The choices they make. And as I was saying, if you think about survivors, they are so often not allowed to make those key decisions around how they presence themselves within the world. That is so often something that is dictated to, as I said, by these particular juridical demands of what that legible voice needs to sound like. So what does it mean to say someone like Moneo who presences themselves with the magnificent garland of flowers. And so there's a measure of, as I said, foregoing of absolute control in framing. The aleatory, as it does happen within the sonic register of the work, happens also within the formal framing of the work. There was an instance, if I have time just to tell you about the one instance with a particular collaborator in Kiev who is an activist deeply involved within queer communities within Ukraine, and who chose to render themselves visible and very present within the video. Of course, following that, they, I think it was just a few weeks later after I'd filmed them, enlisted in the army. Now, before I went and filmed there, and this was very key, it was absolutely to pick up on the exceptional, devastating situation of the full Russian invasion of Ukraine. But I also said, given that my relationship with them dated back to 2019, that it needed to pick up on what is an absolutely quotidian, endemic situation of patriarchal violence, anti-fem, anti-queer situation, order within the country. And of course, so she went from the situation of not having been in the army and then having enlisted. Given the situation of particularly queer soldiers within that army, not wanting to reveal her identity, but still participate in the work. And I had to work very carefully with my editor, which I did in close dialogue with her throughout it, about how I would do that. And we literally shifted her across the frame so that all you see is a shoulder, withholding her name, because she chose to then withhold her name, because of course she didn't want to disclose her identity. But, and I think this is also in terms of speaking of agency, languaging, it's not anonymous. Their account is a queer woman soldier who chooses to withhold her name. So there's still those very key pointers. They are queer, they are a soldier, but they are choosing to withhold their name, and that is powerfully agential. So that's an absolute example of one in which the work had to respond. It had to respond to what this individual needed, their conditions in terms of engagement, as I was saying. So it's not necessarily always about the fixed regimen of my absolute authorial view of what I want this work to look like. It's responding to the desires and wishes of those who are participating within this work.
Thank you so much for that question and answer, Gabrielle. The next question is going to come from Chloe, and I'll give you a chance to unmute, Chloe.
This conversation has been such a true pleasure to listen to. Thank you both so much for being here and having this conversation today. Gabrielle, I'm really interested in when you maybe, I don't know if I don't want to use the right verb because I want you to define the verb, but when photography became the way that you were going to manifest some of this collaboration and these ideas, especially considering the history of photography and the way the work upends that and thinks about it in a new and different way that's replete with possibility, and that really roots the practice in the act of sharing, the act of being not you, but a collective of people. And I'm really curious about that moment when it kind of emerged as the way that you were going to make the work.
Thank you, Chloe. That's a wonderful question. So absolutely, if anything, and perhaps I'll focus on Berenice here. I speak of Berenice as a work that is not photography. It is not photographic. It pushes at the limits of what constitutes the photographic. And absolutely attending always to the violent histories of the lens, to capture and fix bodies and lands. so when I think of a work, of course, I am deploying the photographic as a medium in producing and making possible a work like Berenice. However, I've always spoken of it as a highly conceptual photographic intervention in that it refuses the photographic lexicon of capture, of fixing bodies in space and time. I've often felt that when you come to a work like Berenice, there's something about it that it radiates. These are not static images on the wall. These are presences. And that comes through in absolutely attending to the power dynamics of the medium of photography. In how do these individuals present themselves? They come from a community of those whom I think and work and alongside and greatly admire. They gift of themselves, and in doing so, presence themselves in the in the absent presence of Berenice. They gift of themselves. They channel. They stand in as these surrogate presences. So there's something highly performative about a work like Berenice that, as I say, pushes at the limits of what constitutes the photographic and refuses, if you think about that total capture of the photographic, to render certain subjects available to a kind of indexicality. This also is something that a work like Berenice absolutely refuses, in that each person comes to willingly, consensually gift themselves, stand in, and channel that presence. And as I say, really pushes at the fixed frame. They exceed it. And of course, the fact that the durée of the work, it is ongoing. That phrase, life work, how I came to that was, if I speak of mourning, if I speak of mourning as something that must be ongoing, that must continue, why did it end? Why have I not continued to mourn and recall Berenice? And of course, because just to give everyone a sense of Berenice, Berenice tracks each year of Berenice's life unlived with a photographic portrait with individuals, brown and black women, standing in for, and my apologies, non-gender conforming individuals as well, standing in for Berenice for each year unlived from the year she was killed up until the present day. So the first was Berenice 10 to 28. And then, of course, I picked it up again and I produced the next cycle, which was 29 to 39. And then the next cycle, which I just produced, which is 40 to 42. And I myself stand in each cycle for Berenice. And of course, this is a work that tracks my own life and will carry on with me until I breathe my last breath.
Thank you so much for that answer and for today.
Thank you, Chloe.
Thank you for that question, Chloe. That concludes our Q&A. We're going to close out with an offering by Gabrielle. I'll give you a chance to introduce it.
Okay, so I'm looking, I am still with you and present. I'm just looking at it on my iPad. So forgive me for reorientating my gaze. So as I was saying, these alternative offerings, or as Eriola had introduced them earlier on, are these spaces, these loopholes of retreat, in which each collaborator is given the opportunity to decide what they want to share, particularly given that a work like Personal Accounts withholds lexicality. And in the wake of that particular strategy of withholding those spoken words, what they would nonetheless like to share, because as Eriola was saying, there is still a desire to know, to relate. Language is the ways in which we do come to know and understand each other and grapple and make meaning out of madness. But nonetheless, it's very beautiful to me how so many collaborators often chose to share something counter to a narrative account. So, and that also is so powerful and agential to not feel, and this is something that I impressed upon each one of them, that I, even as the maker of this work, did not need to be privy to absolutely anything they didn't want me to be privy to. That was theirs to decide what they shared, what they disclosed. And so Kava, an extraordinary individual who is serving on the front line in the Ukraine, and who really challenged many of us to think about what a free Ukraine looks like. And that of course, is not without its fractures, particularly for someone like Kava. They're thinking about a free Ukraine that is hospitable to her, to queer life, to femme life. And they shared this magnificent poem with me. So I shall read it to you now. These same eyes saw people's last breath exit, and their gaze glisten and fade. And words get stuck on their lips. Blood exits their body and death enters. They saw the imprints of explosions, battle, lingering hope for counteroffensive, joyous laughter, and creeping fear painted on my brothers in arms' faces. These same eyes saw a happy smile appear on my friend's face when he first got to hold his newborn daughter. With arms that killed men, with arms that held soldiers' breathless bodies, to soothe and to pay respects. Now they were holding a newly emerged life. A samsara wheel turns, and we were lucky not to get crushed. I wonder, how much can one actually see before turning mad, before going numb? I close my eyes. Enough seeing, and a quiet rush floods over me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was such a beautiful way to close us out. Thank you, Gabrielle, and thank you, Eriola. I'd also like to thank Jack from MoMA's PS1 for their support and preparing for today's event, as well as members from Gabrielle's studio. We'd also like to thank the Marianne Bolton Kippy Stroud Foundation and Tiger Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program and making these weekday conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 25 years. A donation directly supports our writers, staff, and operations. Support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free, join us next Tuesday at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Ashra Lifton and Jason Rosenfeld on the event of Cat's Cradle at Nino Meyer Gallery. And as Israel tradition, you can now all join us in
The
saying
chorus.
goodbyes.
The chorus. It's beautiful.
Thank you all so much.
Bye, bye,
Thank
bye,
you
bye.
so much.
you,
Thank
everyone, for joining.
Thank you. Bye,
Gabrielle.
bye, bye.
Thank you,
Thank you very
Gabrielle
much.
and
Appreciate it.
Ariola.
Thank you, Gabrielle.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
That
you
was
so
so
much.
beautiful.
Thank you. Have
Thank
a
you,
good day, everyone.
Abiola.
Thank you.
Gabrielle. Thank
And do
you.
go see the show at MoMA PS1,
Yes.
Yes, we have
everybody.
until March 16th. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
March
Go
16th.
twice, 3 times. It's a musty experience. Okay, you guys?
Can't
Very
wait.
important.
Can't wait to
Gracias.
go back. Thank you so much,
Congratulations,
Gabrielle and
Gabrielle.
Ariola.
Thank you. Thank you,
Bye,
Ariola.
everybody.
Have a great
Bye.
afternoon. Bye.